It all began with an unexpected message about an expedition on the Turkish-Syrian highland border, where a group of archaeologists was studying an ancient crevice recently exposed after powerful underground tremors. At first, these excavations promised nothing unusual: fragments of pottery, traces of brick walls, dried corridors leading into the depths of underground cavities. But at some point, the archaeologists stumbled upon something that shocked even the most skeptical researchers. At the very bottom of a deep depression under a fault line, they found a massive half-ruined portal made of an unknown material that looked like a fusion of stone and metal. As soon as the first reports about the strange glow emanating from this portal appeared on social media, numerous conspiracy theorists and researchers of biblical history began to analyze every photo and video, trying to link them with ancient prophecies. But the most disturbing thing was not the pictures or footage. At night, the expedition base, set up in an old military outpost, recorded low-frequency vibrations coming from the excavation site. The sound resembled a measured heartbeat mixed with a rumbling roar, as if thunderous whispers rose from beneath the earth. The pitch of these sounds shifted oddly, and some members of the expedition swore they heard something like words or groans in them. It was impossible to understand the language, but the feeling was as though someone was calling out or moaning in response to contact with the ancient portal. Naturally, the question arose: could these excavations be part of a biblical storyline? Were these the very underground forces mentioned in apocryphal or even canonical texts? Many recalled the Book of Enoch and tales of fallen angels imprisoned in gloomy chambers. But the mere fact of a huge structure buried beneath the earth on the Syrian-Turkish border, recently rocked by earthquakes and military conflicts, made people fear something big and inexplicable. A few days later, when the researchers continued excavations, it became clear that the portal led to a system of underground corridors descending dozens of meters. Thick vaults covered with unknown writings were made of stone so tightly fitted that they seemed as strong as any modern monolithic structure. Under intense lamplight, drawings emerged on the walls, figures resembling giants with disproportionately long arms, spirals of symbols twisting around them. Some archaeologists said these images looked like records of an ancient confrontation, something like celestial beings against colossal forces. Discovering the first niche, the researchers opened a huge sarcophagus of dark basalt. When they moved the heavy slab, they found several bones inside, clearly human but much larger than normal. Field analysis suggested that whoever these remains belonged to might have stood over 3 meters tall. Even stranger was that a kind of metal staff lay nearby, adorned with runes that no one could decipher. Rumors that these were the remains of Nephilim, the offspring of fallen angels, quickly spread around the world. On the internet, videos with titles like "Return of the Ancient Giants," "Prison of Fallen Angels Discovered," and "The Biblical Catastrophe is Coming" went viral. What caused a particular stir was that almost at the same time, astronomers began talking about an upcoming partial solar eclipse. Many saw it as no coincidence, recalling Christ's words from the Gospel: "The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light." The atmosphere grew more and more charged. One night, near the camp, electronics suddenly failed, and strange flashes or lights appeared around the perimeter. No one had time to figure it out precisely. Luminous patterns seemed to glide through the air, and the deep rumble intensified. Rumors spread that local residents had begun to leave nearby villages en masse, fearing a curse or the breakout of unknown forces from underground. Some claimed that at dawn they saw a huge shadow slide along the mountain range, as if it were a winged creature. Correlating historical facts, biblical scholars recalled the prophecies of Joel and the revelation of John the theologian, which speak of unprecedented disasters and beings emerging from the abyss in the last days. Some insisted that the discovered portal was the entrance to the legendary prison where God confined the very fallen angels mentioned in the Old Testament. and that their release would be the final act of the clash between heaven and hell. Others, more pragmatic, warned that extremists or secret cults might exploit mass superstition to destabilize the region. However, these voices were drowned out by the growing global excitement. Countless bloggers and prophets proclaimed the end of the world was near, urging followers to repent. The number of pilgrims soared, all wanting a glimpse of what they believed to be the place hiding the keys to the abyss. Then came another shocking piece of news. Several geophysicists from different countries announced that, beneath the surface at the excavation site, there was an anomalous source of radiation that defied logical explanation. Their instruments showed energy bursts in sync with the periodic tremors, and that same infrasound heard at night by the researchers. One specialist said such signatures were not characteristic of volcanic or tectonic activity, but resembled more of an organized pulsed wave, as though some mechanism or entity was emitting vibrations according to a specific cycle. This fueled the mystics' claims that a giant entity might be living underground, perhaps the fabled Leviathan from the Psalms and the Book of Job, a monstrous creature capable of spewing flame and representing absolute chaos. Archaeologists and military experts made an attempt to go deeper. Several people descended into the lowest tunnel, where they discovered something like a ritual hall. Columns carved from black stone bore bas-reliefs depicting complex scenes. Winged figures holding swords, like guards, surrounding a round basin at the center of the hall. Traces of dried liquid were visible along the edges of the basin, and in the recessed niches of the stone walls, there were artifacts arranged with care. Strange plates that might once have been used for sacrifices or occult rituals. Many recalled Old Testament references to pagan rites and their attempts to summon otherworldly spirits. But most shocking was that above this basin, an inscription had been carved, which, upon a cursory translation, could be linked to the words, "the gates of a buried power." Later, it was discovered that the text resembled a mixture of Akkadian and an unknown language close to ancient Sumerian. According to Assyriologists, that inscription contained an exhortation to guard the burden of the prison lest the time of invasion arrive. At the same time, major media outlets began reporting on a massive sandstorm rolling in from the desert toward the region. Atmospheric anomalies, an increase in the number of storms, and sudden temperature swings all seemed inseparable from the events unfolding underground. As always, people were split between those who saw in this only a chain of coincidences, and those who insisted that these were direct signs of apocalyptic scenarios. Meanwhile, news came from Jerusalem of an unusual phenomenon. At popular holy sites, including the Western Wall and the Temple Mount, several pilgrims claimed they saw smoky lights in the sky, like fiery threads crossing the expanse from east to west. Once again, talk of omens and the imminent day of the Lord, when the powers of heaven shall be shaken, grew louder. New details emerged every hour. For example, a theologian claimed he'd found references to the Oath of Michael in a secret monastic archive, describing how the archangel sealed away 4 mighty beings in a stone womb until an appointed day. He hypothesized that this could coincide with the area of the excavations. He said that once the seal weakened, the world would face a colossal confrontation with forces beyond human understanding. Amid the growing panic, another rumor caused a stir. A group of explorers managed to go even deeper into the underground structure. A few never returned, and only the remains of damaged equipment were found, along with symbols scratched into stone slabs, reminiscent of sigils or seals that someone seemed to be trying to remove from the walls. Video recordings from the cameras were distorted. The screen showed only static and flashes, and at times, amidst the noise, inhuman howls or blood-chilling moans could be heard. Everyone who watched the recordings described a crushing sense that something was watching them from the darkness. At the first light of dawn, a storm arose around the camp. Dust and sand whirled about in a terrible vortex. Visibility disappeared for an instant, and in that swirling storm, Expedition members swore they saw enormous silhouettes, gliding as if winged giants. Some shouted that they could make out screams, vaguely like calls for release or oaths of loyalty to some unknown master. Then, at the height of the storm, thunderous sounds erupted from beneath the ground, and the crater near the portal collapsed even deeper. These events were immediately picked up by global media. During live broadcasts, news anchors tried to comment on the disaster with trembling voices, forced to quote biblical passages about fallen stars and trumpet blasts. Viewers online panicked, asking if the foretold time of Great Tribulation had begun. Politicians and military officials remained silent, and when they did issue statements, they only assured people that the situation was under control. But it was too late to calm anyone. The air felt electrified, as if the atmosphere was sliced by an energy from other worlds. The partial eclipse arrived at the predicted astronomical time. Everything seemed to plunge into a tense twilight. At that moment, grayish fog began to rise from the heart of the uncovered underground chamber. Leaked footage showed blurry outlines of four column-like figures swaying and growing in height. It was impossible to see them clearly, but the glow and rumbling they emitted were unnatural. A flash of light flared and went out, and witnesses spoke of a colossal pressure, as though a tidal wave of fear and despair struck their minds. Right then something happened that many called a rending of the veil. The sky flickered with what looked like lightning, but it shot vertically downward, straight into the earth. All around the world, people reported strange dreams of towering figures bound in chains and voices telling them to prepare for a new era. Some interpreted it as mass hallucination, while others saw a direct link to ancient texts, mentioning that in the last days, people would experience dreams and visions. Hours later, earthquakes hit the region chaotically, and most of the underground corridors collapsed. Surviving archaeologists claimed that in the final instant, they managed to see clear signs on the walls of the chamber, indicating that four beings once sealed by archangels had either broken free or at least shattered their seals. And while skeptics repeated that nothing supernatural could have happened, reality suggested otherwise. Mysterious incidents spiked in the surrounding areas. People reported glowing silhouettes over nighttime roads and heard the same infrasound that provoked dread and headaches. Many locals insisted that visitors with enormous shadows roamed their villages, and animals refused to come out at night. Alongside all this, new military conflicts flared. Some factions, seeing a sign of impending ruin, decided it was time to establish a new order and seize strategic sites. Clashes escalated, and on the world stage, politicians spoke more and more of a possible global confrontation, ramping up hostile rhetoric. Each evening, television and blogs echoed biblical lines about the end of the age and the battle in the Valley of Armageddon. Most disturbing of all was further evidence that people who visited the ruins no longer acted like themselves. They developed obsessive delusions, muttered phrases in an unknown language, and their eyes revealed something inhuman. Doctors could only shrug, as tests showed no poison or known pathogen. However, all of them, as if by one voice, mumbled numbers and dates in their sleep, as though receiving orders from the freed ones. Eventually, an international team of scientists tried a desperate move. They brought a special device capable of generating powerful electromagnetic pulses to the underground site. Their plan was simple: seal off access to the prison by denying those anomalous entities any interaction with the surface. But when they switched on the device, there was a colossal energy surge. For a few seconds, time seemed to freeze. Then a brilliant flash tore across the sky, and the ground shook so violently that deep cracks spread across the surface for many kilometers. From these fissures poured a dense darkness, unlike fog or smoke, more like black wind flowing in defiance of logic. Those who survived screamed about hordes of shadows rushing free, as if unleashed. After this, the region was declared a closed zone. Any videos were quickly blocked or removed from the internet, and official representatives of various countries spoke of a humanitarian crisis. urging the public not to panic. But panic had already seized neighboring areas. Some claimed they saw apparitions of these shadows. Some said they were demonic servants of the fallen angels, and others blamed everything on a global elite conspiracy. Meanwhile, terrified locals fled en masse to western cities, which had their own problems. Bright lights, reminiscent of auroras, began to appear over skyscrapers and megacities, though such phenomena had never been noted in those latitudes. Scientists tried to solve the riddle, assuming it was due to a sudden shift in the Earth's magnetic fields. Yet the same words kept echoing. Something broke loose, something strong and ancient. Online, prophecies spread. When the gates of the earth are opened, the fallen will return, and their breath will change the face of the world. Such talk prevailed everywhere. People wondered whether this was truly the time of the Antichrist, whether humanity was being drawn into the final spiritual battle, and if the remnant of the faithful would endure the great trials. As chaos escalated, news surfaced of a mysterious old manuscript in a Sin monastery describing legendary winged giants, bound by angels of light, imprisoned where the borders of Babylon once intersected. According to the legend, these giants were allies of 4 archfoes of the heavenly order who swore to overturn the human world when the bloody wind and the black sun aligned on the same day. Even if this sounded like a fairy tale, in light of the real catastrophes, no one was laughing anymore. Of course, rational minds attempted to find natural explanations. They suggested a hidden volcanic fissure caused unusual gas emissions triggering hallucinations and could account for the shadows and sounds. Some claimed advanced technological illusions with projections and infrasound were used for provocation. But it was becoming increasingly clear that events had gone beyond the ordinary. Within weeks of the eclipse, a series of other natural disasters rocked the world. A tsunami on a far eastern coast, hurricanes on western continents, a sudden wave of earthquakes in the southern hemisphere. News agencies competed in announcing the world's end. Stock markets were in chaos. People lost trust in any official statement. Right then, a strange video spread across the internet. A man calling himself the Keeper of the Seal stood against a rocky cave background and declared the true purpose of the discovered portal had been revealed to him. According to him, the gate was not just an underground temple, but a spiritual nexus that restrained evil spirits from entering our world. Yet the seal placed by the archangels on that nexus was now broken. Only unity in repentance and faith could stand against the invasion. He invoked the prophet's revelations about the final harvest of souls. His speech triggered a storm of responses. Some mocked him, others wept in terror. Still others fled to remote areas hoping to outlast the impending catastrophe far from the cities. Ever since, a few months have passed, and the world fell into a grim calm before the storm. Technological failures, magnetic anomalies, occasional reports of giant shadows, and subterranean apparitions. These all formed a terrifying backdrop to daily life. In major capitals, protests abounded, often accompanied by religious slogans. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and all sacred places were overflowing with people searching for answers or just a shred of hope. Yet a hushed whisper that the open gates could no longer be closed by human means refused to die down. The participants of that ill-fated expedition, who survived and did not lose their minds, were placed under strict guard. From their confused testimonies, one thing was clear. They truly encountered something that defied the laws of nature and possessed an ancient, overpowering will. And if their words were true, these entities were not confined to one place. They might already be everywhere, especially where spiritual emptiness prevailed, where people had renounced the commandments and worshipped false idols. It was not hard to guess how panic or despair engulfed humanity when, one day, a major international observatory reported an unknown object resembling a comet fragment approaching Earth's orbit and possibly passing very close by. No confirmation of an impact, but apocalyptic moods surged. Some declared it must be wormwood, or another herald of final judgment. Information space seethed with rumors, video pleas, prophecies, and calls for salvation. People desperately sought any sign that all of this might end well. However, eyewitnesses from the excavation area adamantly claimed, "The seals are torn, and ancient evil roams the earth. All we can do is rely on faith and await a great intervention from above." Thus arrived the time when half the world was paralyzed by fear and the other half fought on, searching for hope. A silent darkness seemed to hang over humanity, and each new day brought another report of mystical phenomena, disasters, or revelations. Some saw them as angelic light, others as ominous glows. In the face of this anxious turmoil, the key question arose. No matter how powerful these fallen creatures might be, could humanity rise up against them? And if so, how? Through armies, technology, or spiritual rethinking and turning to the Creator? No one knew for sure, but one thing was obvious. The line between the familiar world and biblical prophecies had blurred. In the excavations that had at first seemed like a historical sensation, a trigger for events capable of changing the course of planetary history was hidden. During the final week before the decisive moment, many expected the appearance of terrible signs. Some guessed the heavens would open and archangels would battle creatures of darkness. Others imagined more buried cities and unknown technologies would surface to defeat the intruders. Still others believed the real weapon was repentance and mercy, for the Revelation text repeatedly states, "The Lord does not desire destruction, but that all might turn to Him." And as the eastern sky flickered with the first traces of a new storm, as radio signals went dead, and reporters described a menacing crimson glow overhead, it became clear that time was running out. Somewhere far away, fires raged, and in the ruins of the underground chamber, which had been definitively buried by the earthquakes, a spark of divine sealing might still have glimmered, holding back the nightmare. But could it withstand the onslaught of the forces now freed? Only fragmentary broadcasts came in from different parts of the globe, describing people seeing giant phantom warriors, hearing roars and shockwaves, feeling an encroaching darkness even with the sun overhead. So ended the latest reports, suggesting that humanity was on the threshold of the final chapter of its story. Whether total downfall or the arrival of saving power would follow, no one could say. One thing remained: to observe what was happening and remember that even in the darkest prophecies, there was hope for the ultimate triumph of light over darkness. And in that moment, when gloom and chaos seemed all-consuming, an invisible horizon of faith continued to flicker at the edge of consciousness, as if inviting anyone ready to heed the silent call to repentance and unity, to stand against the advancing storm and forge a path to the coming dawn, even in the very heart of the apocalypse. And yet, in that gloomy time, when it seemed that the last glimmers of light had faded, a quiet wind of change swept across the desolate lands. It wasn't like an ordinary wind. Many said they sensed warm notes of solace in it, even though the sky remained heavy and leaden. Those who still found the strength to pray felt a strange tremor beneath their feet, as though the very earth was awakening to something greater than a simple catastrophe. Again and again, blue flashes flickered somewhere above the ruins of the ancient temple where the portal once stood. Reports of mysterious figures woven from shimmering lines of light came from different places. They were seen above abandoned settlements, over cracked roads, even near high-rise buildings in the big cities left without electricity. A tense whisper spread through the air that all these glimmers were only harbingers of the last act yet to come. Rumors of the four who were freed grew stronger. Surviving witnesses swore that near the former excavation camp, they heard not only the low rumble, but also sharp shrieks, almost ultrasonic, making one's hair stand on end. Some found tents torn to pieces and traces of huge paws or claws, seemingly scorched into the ground by an unknown energy. The military forces still present in the region hastily abandoned their temporary checkpoints, officially due to renewed earthquakes, unofficially out of fear of what no modern weaponry could resist. People left without protection or aid headed deeper into the mountains, hoping to hide there from an unseen horror. But there was no peace even there. Witnesses recounted how the fog often took on strange shapes, and that faint sparks flickered within, forming outlines of inhuman faces. At night, one could sometimes make out shadows moving in single file along the mountain ridges, as though tracking those who had strayed too far. Although chaos and despair reigned all around, the voices of believers grew louder, priests and imams. Those who chose not to flee gathered the survivors, prayed under the open sky, and called for repentance. People said that in such moments, a mysterious inner strength would come over them, helping ward off panic. Holy places became crowded despite the constant threat of wars and natural disasters. Many were willing to risk their lives just to find some fragments of solace within walls where prayers were still heard. At the same time, many cities saw the rise of sensational figures proclaiming themselves prophets of a new age. They urged people not toward repentance, but toward preparation for battle, declaring that only brute force, ritual sacrifice, and ancient rites would defeat the giants that had emerged. Quiet talk suggested that these imposters were secretly trying to make contact with whatever had crawled up from the underground, hoping to strike a bargain with darkness. An even heavier stench pervaded the air, as though evil spirits now roamed the open world, luring the wavering to their side. Addressing the subject of the comet-like object approaching Earth, astronomers confirmed that its trajectory had shifted after a series of powerful solar flares. New calculations indicated that this celestial mass might pass so close that its gravitational anomalies would be catastrophic. People remembered prophetic lines about a star falling from the heavens, bringing bitterness and ashes, and they expected something terrible, or perhaps salvific, with its arrival. The mysterious Keeper of the Seal, who had previously addressed the public, suddenly went silent. He was no longer seen online or on the streets. Rumor had it that he was leading a small band of daredevils into the heart of the collapsed subterranean halls, hoping to recreate the ancient patterns still preserved in the rubble. It was believed that if one could restore the lost writings designed to keep the fallen spirits locked away, the world might still be saved from final destruction. Yet this idea sounded almost like a fairy tale amid the raging disasters. Many researchers who had not left these troubled lands spoke of the planet's reaction, as if the release of the Fall and other creatures from the abyss had intensified the tectonic fault lines, causing incessant seismic activity, and in certain areas, powerful electromagnetic bursts incapacitated equipment. It was as though the Earth's crust quaked from an unending war to seize reality. News came from isolated mountain monasteries about certain visions experienced by monks in deep meditation. They described gigantic wings wreathed in flames piercing the skies, and heard a thunderous voice repeating one word in an unknown language. They couldn't translate the term, but it was clearly heralding a decisive clash of forces once consigned to the bottom of creation. Several biblical scholars pointed to lines from ancient apocrypha referencing the angel's song and the archangel's thunder, noting that specifically the thunderous word of Michael should end the age of darkness. Although all this intermingled with feverish imagination and new terrors, many believed the final was near. Meanwhile, over several megacities, there appeared phenomena resembling blazing circles in the sky. Rings of condensed lightning seemed to hover above buildings for a few minutes before abruptly vanishing, leaving behind an ozone smell and crackling audible on radio receivers. Some linked this to modern technology or secret military experiments, but others claimed these circles were seals, scorched by the force permeating the atmosphere in final preparation for the arrival of the great ruler. During this period, a psychic noise intensified. Sensitive people and mediums said their dreams had become one continuous nightmare in which they wandered an endless corridor, seeing crowds bowing to four gigantic shadows, and at the center of a hall stood a cracked altar stained with dried blood. It seemed as though these nightly visions filled human minds, causing depression and collective hysteria. And yet, in the midst of all that darkness, small pockets of goodness and compassion fled to life. People helped each other survive, sharing whatever supplies remained. There emerged teams of volunteers who risked their lives to evacuate the elderly and children from flooded areas. At dusk, these volunteers sometimes witnessed astonishing scenes. A gentle light, like moonlit paths, would materialize over ruined roads, and for an instant all the horrors would recede, as though nature herself was trying to counterbalance the raging chaos with glimmers of wonder. Certain theologians began to read the prophecies in a new way. Perhaps only by traversing this profound night would the world finally leap towards something renewed, and the released forces were a trial meant to cleanse humanity of lies and pride. Meanwhile, a group of dedicated scientists attempted again to reach the zones where the portal had once been. They avoided open roads and traveled mainly under cover of darkness, so as not to attract attention from the military or wandering creatures. Along the way, they discovered an abandoned camp filled with frozen equipment. Monitors showed chaotic energy surges. Judging by the logs, the peak occurred during the last large earthquake. In one damaged laptop, they found an unfinished report mentioning a deep source of radiation that reacted to the emotional state of the people nearby. The analysis was incomplete, but the author hinted that the portal's energy intensified when fear and anger grew around it. Eventually reaching the collapsed area near the underground temple, the scientists saw the entrance had caved in. But from beneath the heap of stones emanated a faint reddish glow, barely visible in the evening twilight. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and a drawn-out roar from somewhere deep below broke off into an echo. Undeterred, they began clearing the rubble. In mere minutes, they all felt something literally weighing on their minds. Some experienced visions of a giant silhouette, motionless in a colossal chamber. Trembling fingers pointed to a pictogram engraved on a stone slab, resembling a symbol reminiscent of the seal the keeper had spoken of. When the stone was shifted aside, behind it, they found a sort of passage sloping downward. Darkness reigned there, but they felt compelled to proceed, sensing that time was running out and the answer lay in the very heart of the nightmare. In the dark, they moved by touch, attuned to every rustle. Through the stone layers came muffled moans, like distant vocal vibrations. Deeper in the tunnel, they found a partially flooded niche glowing with that red light. Ancient symbols carved in a circular formation seemed to shimmer slowly, in sync with the heartbeat of that subterranean organ. Suddenly, one of the scientists, an archaeologist, made out a fragment of text scrawled on the wall in the same mixed language. Apparently part of an old formula meant to maintain the creature's confinement. It spoke of the oath of the lunar meridian and the necessity of recreating the key name before the sun was distorted by the next eclipse. Strands of speculation came together into a single pattern. They needed to find the missing word, perhaps that formidable name the Archangel had once used to seal away the fallen. Without that name, the darkness grew stronger. The scientists set out to record the symbols so they could decode them later. But as they drew closer to the glowing glyphs, a roar like a roaring waterfall filled the passage, and a shadow, darker than ordinary darkness, began to slide toward them. It seemed to have its own consciousness. It flowed along the walls, reached out for the group, and its touch caused an instant icy pain. They fled toward the exit, but the shadow engulfed some of them. The last thing the survivors managed to see were flashes of strange symbols that flared on the victim's body, and a scream cut short by hollow silence. It was terrifying and defied reason, but two people escaped, clutching scraps of recorded writing in their hands. Soon, local refugees picked them up. Legend has it they headed under night's cover to an ancient monastic library in the mountains, where they might still decipher the inscriptions. Throughout the world, a tense atmosphere grew thicker. Those mysterious circles in the sky now appeared over nearly every continent, and astronomers said the comet had begun to slow strangely, as if something were holding it in orbit. The keeper of the seal remained out of contact. Chaos sparked by fear, rage, and the preaching of false prophets spread. People tore apart the remaining churches they deemed signs of another interference, and sought refuge in weapons, forgetting the last glimmer of mercy. It seemed the world was hurtling towards self-destruction, mirroring the release of ancient powers from below. But in these darkest days, acts of unexpected compassion became more frequent. Occasionally someone recognized the same frightened human being in an enemy, or saw future hope in a starving child. Tiny steps, yet humankind tried to resist the all-consuming darkness. Finally, the news came of an imminent total solar eclipse, which calculations showed would occur directly over those once sacred lands where the portal and halls had been discovered. People took this as the final hour. If the seals were not restored, the fall would fully gain power, and the awakened abyss would devour our world. Governments no longer had any control over events. All eyes turned to those who dared go down into the underground depths or study long-forgotten prophetic texts. A whirlpool of last days began, in which everyone lived with the realization that the very existence of humanity was at stake. And so, with the ill-fated hour drawing near, amid howling winds and unending earthquakes, people in many parts of the world stood under the open sky, hoping for a miracle or a sign from above. The heavens seemed to stand still, as though awaiting something decisive. A menacing twilight fell earlier than usual, the clouds coiling as if about to collapse into a giant funnel, and the earth let out strange groans. From afar came the howling of supposed giants, and no one could say whether they were preparing to attack or were already exulting. There was nothing left but to await the moment when the moon would dance that ominous dance with the sun, and in that fleeting interval it would become clear whether the world would fall into the abyss or find the very spark everyone called the final hope. As the day of the total solar eclipse drew closer, a palpable tension pressed down on every corner of the world, as though the very air had thickened in anticipation of that final verdict. Rumors circulated that the ragged band of scientists, clutching scraps of ancient text, had reached a hidden monastery high in the mountains, yet no one could confirm it. Meanwhile, in the ravaged cities, the sky darkened prematurely, taking on a strange bruised hue that flickered with silent lightning. Panicked mobs roamed the streets, some desperately seeking shelter, others lashing out in fury at whatever they believed responsible for the looming cataclysm. Reports arrived that a massive shape was sighted trudging across a desert plateau under a crimson twilight. Eyewitnesses swore it was the silhouette of one of the four, towering like a moving mountain. Elsewhere, uneasy alliances formed among scattered military units, faith leaders, and ordinary civilians who'd chosen solidarity over despair. Despite the encroaching chaos, small groups set up makeshift sanctuaries where they offered each other food, water, and a glimmer of hope. They used solar-powered lamps and salvaged generators to keep a feeble glow alive through the night. Their stories spoke of fleeting miracles. An old man who'd vanished under a collapsing building only to emerge days later unscathed. A child lost in swirling floodwaters who was found miles away, asleep yet unharmed. In these pockets of calm, people whispered that some higher mercy had not abandoned them. But each time the ground shuddered or strange lights rippled across the clouds, dread tightened its grip. Soon, the dreaded hour arrived when the moon's disk began sliding over the face of the sun. Across the region where it would reach totality, the temperature plummeted, and a gloom more profound than ordinary night fell. Wind raced through the valleys, carrying an otherworldly moan. High above, swirling shapes took form in the charcoal sky, reminiscent of winged creatures battling among the clouds. Yet in a hidden alcove deep within the mountains, the two surviving researchers finally laid out the texts they had rescued. By lantern light, they consulted an aged monk who claimed knowledge of that mixed script. He turned pages of a fragile manuscript with trembling hands, revealing half-lost prayers and references to an archangel's binding word. Outside, thunder rumbled, and the stone walls of the monastery rattled. The monk, voice cracking, pronounced syllables that seemed to vibrate with ancient power. With each utterance, an unseen force stirred in the corridors, as though the building itself recognized the incantation. The researchers could hardly breathe, feeling both terror and awe at the possibility that the key name might be within their reach. At the height of the eclipse, the sun's corona shimmered an angry gold, and everywhere else turned black as ink. Across the planet, onlookers felt an eerie hush, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Then came a global convulsion. In the area where the first portal had been discovered, a towering column of blood-red light erupted from the ground, lancing upward into the darkness. People cried out in horror as this beam seemed to crack the sky itself. Immediately, monstrous shadows slithered across the land, coalescing into massive figures that rode in a language no human throat could form. The Four had found their hour and their voice. Cracks spread through the earth, revealing surges of fiery energy, and from the depths arose more nightmarish shapes, half-formed horrors that shrieked into the fading light of the eclipse. But then something else rippled through the gloom. A pure, resonant tone that resonated like the peal of an immense bell. In the mountain monastery, the old monk finished reciting a final line of text, his eyes ablaze. The researchers felt the floor tilt, and a sudden whirlwind of pale luminescence erupted from the scriptorium. Beyond the thick stone walls, many miles away, watchers saw beams of white brilliance streak across the heavens, colliding with the red columns of malevolent energy. A great wind howled through the canyons. All over the world, frightened crowds who had gathered in open spaces to witness the eclipse gasped as arcs of stark white light rippled overhead, tearing into the writhing darkness. The earth groaned once more, as if in agony. In a chaotic flash, two of the colossals, shadowy shapes of the Four, lurched under the onslaught of that radiant force. Their howls rattled windows for miles, and then one simply disintegrated into swirling ash. The other reeled, as if struck by an invisible hammer, before collapsing back into a fissure that snapped shut beneath it. For a moment, silence reigned. A suspended heartbeat when no one dared exhale. Then the glow intensified. The brilliant luminescence from the monastery's remote peaks fanned out across the sky, spreading in luminous waves that scourged the clouds and stabbed down into the labyrinths of underground darkness. From the roiling cracks of the portal site, more screams erupted. Some recognized them as the anguished cries of the other two freed ones, still unseen but evidently wounded by this unleashed power. Lightning flickered in every direction. The sun, still eclipsed, glowed with a thin halo, like a crown on a world perched between ruin and redemption. As the final minutes of totality ticked away, the old monk's chanting rose to a crescendo. The phrases he recited interlaced with far-off echoes, almost like a chorus of voices from another realm, responding to him in unison. Then, in a sudden roar of thunder, a single shaft of pure white radiance fell from the heavens straight into the rift where the largest pillar of red energy had stood. The ground convulsed, dust choked the air, and the horrific shrieks from below turned into a dreadful wail before fading into utter quiet. When the sun began to re-emerge, the clouds slowly parted. Around the globe, transmissions resumed, revealing stunned commentary. The monstrous shadows had vanished, and the pillars of crimson light were gone. In many places, the tremors subsided. A few battered enclaves of humanity climbed from their shelters, blinking at the returning daylight, uncertain whether they had been saved or merely granted a reprieve. Survivors near the collapsed portal reported seeing the charred remains of gargantuan limbs or silhouettes that soon crumbled to dust. Others discovered scorched symbols embedded in rock faces, as though seared in by that final blast of divine energy. Far away, in the mountain monastery, the exhausted monk lay slumped against the wall, beads of sweat on his forehead. The two researchers found him still breathing but barely. His eyes opened and, in a hoarse whisper, he murmured, "The name, it is sealed again. But the cost." Then he fell silent, lapsing into unconsciousness. Outside, the ancient walls no longer trembled. The wind sighed softly, carrying a sense of unearthly relief. And so the great crisis appeared to pass. People across continents wept, laughed, or simply stared into the distance, trying to grasp how close annihilation had come. The comet-like object that had threatened to exert catastrophic gravity seemed to drift away, its course altered by some unseen hand. In the following days, a sense of hesitant renewal took root. The skies were tinted by shimmering auroras, lingering aftereffects of the massive energies unleashed, and some found them hauntingly beautiful, a reminder of how fragile existence could be. Though much had been destroyed, and many lives lost, there was no denying that a new humility had settled into the hearts of countless survivors. The stories spread, how monstrous forces that once seemed invincible had been subdued when, in a final hour of unity and faith, ancient bonds were reforged. Yet not all was resolved. Certain extremist circles whispered that fragments of the fall might persist, scattered in remote corners, seeding future horrors. Others speculated that the red beams had only been part of a greater evil, still lurking beyond humankind's comprehension. As relief organizations organized and people tried to rebuild, rumors persisted that somewhere, among the half-ruined labyrinths, the Keeper of the Seal walked alone, searching for any cracks in the renewed wards. No one knew if he had truly joined forces with the old monk, or if he had his own agenda. For now, however, the planet's heartbeat steadied. Vibrations from the Earth subsided, and the new eclipsed sun shone upon a battered world that had, against all odds, survived an ancient threat. Even as the old manuscripts were gathered and locked away, scholars debated the meaning of the final recitation, the significance of that name spoken in the monastery's depths. In scattered temples and mountain chapels, people sang in gratitude, believing that some higher mercy had acted on their behalf. Others warned that it was only a respite, and that vigilance must remain unbroken. Yet beneath all the uncertainty, a flicker of hope emerged. Perhaps a redeemed future awaited, a future shaped by lessons learned in the darkest hour, where humility triumphed over arrogance, and unity over despair. And if any surviving shadows of the fall still prowled unseen, their power was at least checked by the seal once again raised to bar the abyss. For now, dawn rose brighter than before. The world had glimpsed the brink of oblivion, and in that moment discovered it still had the courage to fight for its soul.